So I thought I'd just start off with a Halloween kind of retrospective. For any of you who've had nightmares about the Doctor's weeping angel monsters, this one is looking at you, don't blink. And of course that opens up one of the problems that somebody giving a talk about Doctor Who faces, because some people don't know a great deal about Doctor Who. Some people don't care a great deal about Doctor Who. Most people have some kind of relationship with Doctor Who. Maybe they're fans, maybe they're scholars, maybe they're people who've grown up with it and not realised that perhaps through their lifetime, over of course 50 years, they've spent literally hours and hours, again and again, watching stories about the Doctor and his strange blue box. And I think that posed a question for me too, which was, what was my relationship with Doctor Who? Why Doctor Who at all? Why write a book about Doctor Who? And it was brought home to me particularly clearly just this afternoon, because I hadn't been to this cafe before, so I came down to the cafe, walked in, there was somebody behind the counter serving coffee, and I said, "Oh hello, I'm coming to do the thing about Doctor Who." She said, "Oh, you're the Doctor Who expert." And I suddenly sort of felt a bit cold inside, because I'm not a Doctor Who expert. I don't know what it would mean to be a Doctor Who expert, but I think the more I thought about it, and the more I thought about what my relationship with Doctor Who might be, it would be to say that I'm somebody who's sort of grown up with Doctor Who in the background. I haven't been a fan, I haven't ever been to a Doctor Who convention, I've never bought a Doctor Who scarf, or until very, very recently, through a friend, never drunk from a Doctor Who mug. So, in a way, I feel as if I'm a bit of an imposter. I've travelled with the Doctor, but I'm not really a close companion. And yet, I think it fascinates me. And I think Doctor Who fascinates me, and I hope it fascinates other people, because it's important. And I think Doctor Who is important because it's lasted so long. And because it has a particular way of telling stories, which, because of its format, because of its structure, because of what it tries to do, and because of what it can't do, and that's an important point, because of what Doctor Who can't do, because of what Doctor Who can't talk about, it becomes a very powerful presence in our culture. So that's the sort of long, rambling answer to why Doctor Who. But the other answer, of course, is the date. And this is apparently indelibly written into the minds of fans all over the world, and it is, of course, literally all over the world, under the Twitter hashtag #SaveTheDate, which I think is a remarkable thing to say, actually, save the date. Why would you save the date? Well, it's of course because on the 23rd of November, 50 years after President Kennedy was assassinated, and 50 years after the first episode of Doctor Who was broadcast, we can look back on half a century of what has been an almost entirely consistent presence on Saturday evening TV in this country. And of course, as a national culture, we haven't missed Doctor Who. We haven't failed to notice that his presence, his face, his being is an important part of who we are and how we think and how we communicate about things. And of course, he's celebrated on things like postage stamps, and people are all aware of this Doctor or that Doctor or this Doctor or that Doctor, because of course the other thing that Doctor Who does is he brings together generations. Forget Star Trek generations. Doctor Who has got generations. Everybody can remember their Doctor. I suppose this was mine, and statistically that's maybe a function of the fact that Tom Baker was the Doctor for longer than anybody else, but of course also he was the best. See, apparently, I mean, amongst Doctor Who fans, saying that sort of thing really matters, because I quite like all the others as well. Okay. This will be on the TV in a few weeks' time. Maybe when you're watching it, I hope some of the things that I've said tonight about Doctor Who might come to your minds, but if they don't, then that's probably good. It means you're really enjoying it rather than overthinking it, which is really what Doctor Who is about and really what TV is for, but nevertheless, it's there to watch and there to think about. And people get very excited about anything where there's more than one Doctor on screen at one time, because of course that poses a very interesting question about who the Doctor is, because there's two of him, or in some instances 3 of him or 5 of him, and now perhaps 11 or 12. The other thing I think is really important to realise is that lots of TV shows have huge audiences and long histories. Maybe in a few weeks' time or in a few years' time, somebody at one of these talks will be talking about Coronation Street, and they can say, well, it's bigger than Doctor Who, it's been going longer, it has a bigger audience, it's on more often, and so on. But I don't think that other TV shows could claim what Doctor Who can claim, as evidenced here. This is an interesting archival reference page, and if you click on any one of these Doctor images, you can feed through to fictional writing from fans. And you probably can't read the numbers from the back or even from near the front. But for example, the 10th Doctor, who apparently is a huge favourite, David Tennant, there are 18,040 stories that have been written by people inspired by who he is, what he represents to them. 18,000 stories, novels, short stories, little bits of fiction. And I think that's amazing, because in a sense, what it points to for me, and why it links to my interests in how people think and how people feel when they watch media outputs, why I think that's important is because Doctor Who is brilliant at evoking and inspiring things without spelling them out. And it seems to have a particular power, a particular capacity to draw people in, to write about it, to pick up the stories and to take them somewhere else. So what is it about storying? What is it about the types of narrative that Doctor Who does uniquely well? And I suppose that's really what I'm going to try and talk about today. Obviously also, I'm going to talk about this book. Not because I want you to buy it, although it is available as of 2 weeks' time, including as an e-book, which is really, really good, because we had to work quite hard to persuade the publishers, who are a very traditional and excellent psychoanalytic publisher, but who are a bit later to the game, for example, having e-books. They said Doctor Who fans like the internet. They like reading things online, so please make it available as an e-book, and they said yes. So it can be downloaded, and it will be out in time for the 50th anniversary, which we're very pleased about, because it was a bit of a rush to write, but we're very happy about the book. And of course, really, this book is just another one of these. It's just another one of these 499, 500, 5,027. It's another set of stories about Doctor Who. Perhaps the difference is it's been written by some academics, which for some people will be a reason to read it, for many, many other people it will be a reason not to read it. But the point is, everybody wants to talk about Doctor Who, and I just wonder, and think it'd be a really interesting thing to talk about in a setting like this. What is the question about why? So not Doctor Who, but Doctor Why. Well, what is Doctor Who? I'm assuming there must be at least one person in the room who doesn't know anything about Doctor Who. Because in a sense, this format, the Cafe Scientifique, this Cafe Scientifique format is about bringing people to places and ideas that they haven't come across before. And you can't assume, and you shouldn't assume, and I think sometimes people who are fans of Doctor Who and writers about Doctor Who do assume too quickly that everybody loves it, everybody knows about it, everybody knows what size shoes the Doctor has, what he likes to eat, what his favourite flavour of jelly bean is, and so on. But that's not true. So what is Doctor Who? Well, it's quite simple. It's monsters, it's companions and assistants who are mostly girls, and it's the TARDIS. And I think that the particular ways that the stories in Doctor Who link these three elements together is quite fascinating. And the TARDIS is very important in the way I think about and the way I've kind of got into Doctor Who, because it is the one constant. The Doctor's face always changes, the companions always change. The monsters, of course, change almost literally week by week, certainly in the old classic series. There was what people used to describe as the monster of the week. But the TARDIS never changes. That peculiar, strange blue box is always there, and it, you know, there's minor details that are altered. A St John's ambulance sticker appeared on it a few years ago, I think for reasons of consistency with the past. And I just think that the TARDIS is an astonishingly interesting and rich object. And it's become a rich and interesting object almost by accident, and particularly by the art and by the magic of storytelling. I also love the TARDIS because there's one on the ground floor of where I work, which was completely weird for me. I just came to Bournemouth a few months ago, and I walked in. I thought, oh, I'm writing a book about Doctor Who. There's a TARDIS there. Well, this is good. So it does strike me as, you know, something that's recognised as part of who we are, part of who we are and how we think. So what's interesting or exciting about the TARDIS? Well, there's lots and lots of things to say. It's important to say that it's a police box. It's important to say that it's anachronistic. Even in 1963, there weren't very many of those police boxes around anymore. It's a relic. But if you're a literary scholar or a cultural scholar, then you tend to look for antecedents. You tend to look at different kind of symbols or different ways of framing stories, and to recognise that they're very unlikely to have been original. And of course, the TARDIS has got many antecedents. Alice in Wonderland, of course, walks from one world to another, through a door, through a portal. And I think it would be fair to say that the TARDIS, certainly the way that it's used in many stories, could be very, very easily and readily understood as an example of exactly that kind of portal. It's always a portal into another universe. It's always a portal into another space, and of course another time. This is the wardrobe in Narnia. Well, isn't that just what Amy Pond or Amelia Pond is doing when she's waiting to step into the TARDIS? She's stepping into this peculiar world and finding that, just like the TARDIS, Narnia is bigger on the inside. And of course, this peculiar movement of a space which makes you bigger when you think it's going to constrain you is a very, very important idea. And Alice in Wonderland is explicitly preoccupied with just that kind of transition. The idea that you move between spaces and the way they make you feel about your capacity, your size, your being changes. Your world can seem very small 1 minute, everyday life can seem very small 1 minute. But there's always a doorway through which you can step which makes the world bigger. In Doctor Who it's a kind of literal doorway, scientific and magical as it might be. But of course that doorway is also imaginary, and imagination, if you like, embodied. And this is by no means a, original conception, because as well as people writing fantastic and interesting fan fiction about Doctor Who, there's an awful lot of very, very clever art about Doctor Who, which explicitly makes the conjunction between the Doctor's work or the Doctor's scientific or kind of travels in time and the traditional narrative forms and the traditional preoccupations of fairy stories. So I think it's a reasonable claim to make that although Doctor Who has many things in common, for instance with science fiction, so you might talk about it alongside Star Trek and Star Wars, because of its variety and because of its kind of richness and because of the changes that it's had throughout its history as an evolving television form, it also has something of the fairy tale to it. But it's a fairy tale which for some reason generations can enjoy. Generations from children through to adults, through middle age and into old age. I should say that my co-author, for example, on the In the World of Doctor Who book, he had his golden wedding celebration last year, 50 years of marriage, and he of course remembers the Doctor Who first broadcast being just before his wedding. And in a sense, he's still as preoccupied with Doctor Who now as he was then. So it can be a lifetime preoccupation. I think what's less often said about Doctor Who is to think about another antecedent, to think about another thing that happens in the stories that we often see. Sharon mentioned that I had an interest in comedy, and that's true. One of the things that I learnt about when I studied comedy was that I realised that a lot of contemporary or recent televisual formats, for example, sitcoms, double acts, people like Morecambe and Wise, had their kind of histories in the musical and in the stage performances of the 1920s and 30s. And it seems to me that by accident, probably rather than by design, the TARDIS as well as replicating the kind of mythologies of Narnia, Alice in Wonderland, and the step through the magic door, which is very familiar and obvious to anybody looking at it from that perspective, also captures something else, something fascinating about what happens when you put somebody in a box and subject them to danger. Because it seems to me that part of the kind of emotional and dramatic structure of a Doctor Who episode is that you are watching the jeopardy of somebody who's been put in a box and who may or may not survive. And of course, just like the TARDIS, these boxes are bigger on the inside. And that is, of course, how the assistant, the magician's assistant, can always manage to escape. Now, I'm going to enter into a bit of kind of personal revelation, speculation and conjecture. And I really would like to ask this question again when we're in more sort of discursive mode. But whenever I've watched those kinds of magician shows, and of course you see them less and less nowadays, I think the heyday stroke, the end of that era was probably Paul Daniels and Debbie McGee. Neither of whom would have made a good doctor or assistant. But you can just about imagine it, can't you? But in any case, you don't see them very much. But I'm sure I remember watching those shows and actually being more fascinated, not by how she managed to escape, but what the relationship was between these two people. How does she trust him in that way? And how does he trust her in that way? How can they take these risks with each other? And I think that that's quite an important point to make in the analogy with Doctor Who, because that's also something that's happened with the show as it's developed. Probably actually as a child, you really do want to know, well, how does that happen? How's the magic trick performed? How is she not going to come out bleeding and screaming? Why can't I hear her death, her death happening? It's magic, and you are shocked and amazed. But as you grow older and you know that there's, even if you can't understand how it works, I still don't understand how any of those tricks work. Even if you can't understand it, you stop worrying about the technology of it, you stop worrying about the science of it, but you become interested in the romance of it, because I think that there's an astonishing romance going on between these two people. And I think the same thing has happened in Doctor Who. So we've stopped worrying about how is it that Sarah Jane escapes from the Autons, or why is it that the Sea Devils are suddenly able to be vanquished by this or that press of the sonic screwdriver. And we've started to care about what the relationship is between these people and their box. What's the relationship between Amy and her doctor? What's the relationship between Rose and her doctors? What's the relationship between Donna and her doctors? And I think that's been a conscious effort on the part of the producers of what people talk about as the new Doctor Who, the sort of post-classic series. It's a move from an interest in kind of adventure and science as the framing kind of paradigm, however loosely adhered to, and a move into a framing paradigm which is emotional, which is about the stories that happen between people and the stories that happen within relationships. So just to sum up why I'm interested in Doctor Who, and sort of to sum up really the introduction, it's because it shares quite a lot with this magic box stage show that's always been part of modern entertainment, always been part of modern enchantments. It plays with, as drama should, our anxieties, our hopes and our fears. It actively seeks to articulate transitions, which is why I think it's interesting to adolescents. And of course, what's interesting too, and one of the other transitions that's happened in the 50 years that have gone by since 1963, is the category of adolescent has been invented and then also stretched. So probably everybody in this room recognises that even wherever they are in their life stages, wherever they are in their life cycle, they've retained some touch with the instability, the uncertainty, the anxiety, the fragility of identity, which used to be much more localised in the specific age range of adolescence. So adolescence is a kind of shared experience throughout the life cycle. Doctor Who is absolutely obsessed, as I will try to argue, with transition and with the difficulties of transition. And of course Doctor Who is about growing up. And those of you who do watch Doctor Who will know that that's Amelia Pond and her doctor. And of course, they're both children here. He's barely been regenerated, he's eating fish fingers and custard, and he of course is the fantastic, wonderful, playful clown, the Raggedy Doctor, who is her imaginary friend from her earliest days. Well, I'm going to annoy any real Doctor Who fans in the audience now by committing yet more sacrilege by saying that actually the classic Who series aren't as good as the new ones. Save it up! Save it up! Save it up! Now I don't mean that in the kind of cultural sense or in terms of value, but I mean in terms of they're not as good for me. They're not as good for me because what I want to do is to use Doctor Who to talk about relationships, and I think whereas in the past the relationships, the passions, the companionship, the friendships that happened between the characters were important and noted and felt very passionately and very kind of deeply by people as they watched, including the generations of writers who then went on to run the show and write stories themselves. It wasn't written into the scripts properly. And I think the difference is that the second generation of producers and writers have used their experience of having been fans themselves. They've picked up the emotions that they inferred into the show, and they've actually spread them across the screen, spread them through the dialogue, spread them into the looks and into the direction of the actors on the stage. And the actors do a brilliant job actually of capturing that without ever revelling in it, without ever navel gazing. They leave that kind of revelling and navel gazing to people like me who write books about it. This is an example that I've picked out from the archives. This is the early 80s. I just started to get a bit older and I'd stopped really watching Doctor Who at this stage, but I do remember Peter Davison, the Doctor. He's the only Doctor I've met in real life, not in any conjunction as a Doctor Who thing, but I was at a party he was at. I was steadfastly warned not to say anything about Doctor Who to him or even talk to him at all, and I didn't. That's the end of my anecdote. But Peter Davison is the Doctor. His very long-standing companion, Adric, crashes a spaceship into the Earth, and I'm not going to say anything about special effects, but this is him dying. Good point. But he wouldn't want us to mourn unnecessarily. You know, they're a bit sad, but where are we going? Special treat, cheer us all up. So we'll leave that. We'll leave that, and now what we're going to do, because I think his outfit's got something to do with cricket. We can even drop into Lord's and see Wilson and Pitch playing cricket. Okay, so sorry, Adric, you're dead now. Let's move on. They end up within a few minutes on a Concorde in a completely bizarre story that I couldn't really understand in prehistory between Concords and dinosaurs. It's emotionally not rich, in my view. But I've heard extremely powerful arguments against what I'm saying, who have people who've been able to demonstrate how that generalisation about the classic Who cannot be borne out, because there are some very, very well written and subtle stories. But for the purposes of my argument, this is exactly what it was all like. It was all rubbish. Whereas the new stuff's really, really good, because, for example, this is Rose. Rose and the Doctor parting, and maybe people remember that poignant moment when Rose is first separated from her Doctor. She gets 2 bites of the cherry at Bad Wolf Bay, but we'll come to that later. Rather than saying, oh, I'm off to see the cricket, sorry you're dead, let's not mourn unnecessarily, the Doctor, who stays quite sulky for a good few episodes after he loses Rose, much to Martha's disappointment, I have to say, says, I'm burning up a sun just to say goodbye. He has to communicate with her across some kind of peculiar, made-up scientific galactic fault in order to say goodbye. But the real point here is not a scientific point, it's an emotional point. It's saying, you matter to me so much, and saying goodbye to you properly means so much. the pain of separation from you means so much that I'm burning up a son and I won't be going to cricket. Which is good. Exactly, that's true. So, we could, I mean, and it does, you know, I'm happy to confess that it's a tearjerker. It really is. It really is. People cried. And fans made pop videos out of the footage. And it was a truly, genuinely moving, dramatic moment, which was about emotions and separation and loss, and not about adventure, science, and those types of things. And these types of moments are repeated again and again. Separations and saying goodbye are something that the Doctor tries hard to do, and tries hard to do again and again, and often fails. There's a whole episode which we argue in the book is all about how rubbish the Doctor is at saying goodbye properly to people who he loves. It's closing time. It comes at the end of the 5th season, I think, of the new series. And he's got these wonderful friends who live in Colchester. He spent time with them before, and he goes back to say goodbye because he knows that he's going to die. And he at least makes the effort to go back, but then he keeps forgetting that he's there as a kind of, inverted commas, human, saying goodbye to his friends. And for example, writes a message on the board saying, "I'm off now, bye," you know. But they bring him round. And of course that's the other thing. The difference between the old Who and the new Who is that the assistants and the companions teach the Doctor how to be more human, rather than the other way round. And the Doctor has an awful lot to learn from all of his companions and his assistants, precisely because he's more vulnerable and more emotional. Well, all of this emotion and all of this pain, all these serious themes, love, loss, romance, this is the audience. I mean, I think he's probably a bit young, I'm not sure, I don't know, but kids start watching this from the age of 6, 7, 8, maybe younger. There was a very interesting set of news stories when the first season came out, with children all across London coming up to people in the playground and saying, "Are you my mother? Are you my mother?" Do you remember that? And this was from The Empty Child. An absolutely chilling concept. A chilling and frightening concept. Just as kind of behind the sofa worthy as any Dalek or Cyberman. The idea of an empty child whose only word, whose only remaining kind of remnant of himself is to be able to appeal again and again for a mother who, of course, isn't accepting him, because the story in The Empty Child is that he is the illegitimate son of a mother who, because of the social conventions of the era in which she lives, is unable to acknowledge that she's a 16-year-old mother of a child in the 1940s. It's an absolutely beautiful story. And of course, the children watching it pick up on the emotional resonance of just that simple phrase and repeated it again and again and again across London. It was a very, very interesting instance. But that's, in a sense, what makes Doctor Who brilliant, because they have to put all of these very complex and challenging emotional stories within a framework that is still okay for kids to watch. Everybody knows that there's something going on between the Doctor and his assistants. And everybody also knows that there's nothing going on between the Doctor and his assistants. So Clara teases him, saying that the TARDIS is a snog box. And Amy is here pouncing on the 11th Doctor in just the sort of clinch that he's desperately trying to avoid, but also seems inevitably to want. Most of the new Doctor Who episodes across this story arcs happen within some kind of peculiar love triangle. And I think that's very interesting from a sort of psychological perspective, especially if you're interested in psychoanalytic ideas, for example, because that's what also happens in real relationships and with real feelings. We deny, displace, defer, escape from all of the different attachments and desires that we might want and have. And of course what the Doctor does is he plays out this peculiar relationship between, is it a father and a daughter, or is it potential lovers? And of course in the old Doctor Who, the age gap between them made that even more peculiar. One of the observations we make in the book one of the observations we make in the book is that you know, it was very, very similar to the idea of a science teacher with a young sort of teenage girl taking her on a trip. And that could raise the sorts of questions which, well, and the sorts of anxieties that needed to be defended against. And I think the scriptwriters are very skilled at managing the peculiar tension of saying that the Doctor really loves this girl who he cares for, and he also doesn't love her in that way. And the ambiguity and confusion of that is written through the drama in quite wonderful ways. So sex is both ever present and also deftly hidden. And I think that is a useful observation to make about Doctor Who, because it's also a useful observation to make about everyday life. The other thing that's present all the time in our life, but we tend to work quite hard to forget about it, is death. And the Doctor is brilliant at dying and not dying. He's done it 12, 13 times, so he's pretty expert at it. But of course, it's a fantastic narrative device, isn't it? To have somebody who can be killed off and who will always come back. So instead of the kind of tragic, dramatic challenge that faces authors, for example, I don't know, Taggart is an example that springs to mind, where you've got a hero and you sort of want to kill him, and eventually you do, and then the series kind of dies off. With the Doctor, he's always going to come back. So the authors get to do something much, much better. The writers get to play at killing the Doctor. They can spend a whole season flirting with us about how the Doctor's going to die. And we can bear it, and the audience can bear it, whether they're adults and children, because the death is never quite final. Okay. I guess what I'm working towards is the idea that the Doctor is remarkable as a narrative structure and as a narrative format, because it never quite has closure. And I think that's really important for the type of audience that we're considering, because that part of all of us which is still adolescent, that part of all of us which is still not sure of who we are, what we want to become, what the future is very alert to the idea of not closing things off. Please don't let real life start now, would be a kind of motto for people who are keeping at some kind of distance, at some kind of bay, the kind of inevitable narrative of what you might call a traditional way through life. And so, of course, the Doctor is obsessed, and the writers of Doctor Who are obsessed with weddings and funerals and screwing them up. This is one of the very first villains that we saw in the New Who. Why did Russell T Davies need to make the menacing plastic Nestine dummies who were just about to take over the world dressed in wedding dresses? Just at a time, and just cut against Rose recognising the moment that she's going to choose the Doctor rather than her life in London with no future with Mickey. Why is weddings and marriage seen as a threat? And this is the Doctor in just that episode. Rose is having dinner with Mickey, but he's actually made of plastic. And he mocks the happy couple and reveals Mickey to be a fraud. And of course, that's the beginning of the first of a series of important love triangles that Doctor Who places all of his or her heroines in. And we mentioned this a bit earlier. This is I suppose, David Tennant's version of the cricket is Donna, for no good reason, appears in the TARDIS, and she's literally halfway up the aisle. The wedding is almost there. It's what she's always wanted. She's been seduced by an alien, as it turns out, but as far as she's concerned, she's reached that pinnacle of the kind of narrative normality that she's always been seeking after, and the Doctor rips her away from it. Martha, she's not a doctor, she's nearly a doctor. She's again just coming to the end of a stage and just about to choose an adult life. And she's always caught again in love triangles between the Doctor and Rose, and then later with various other characters, including Joan Bedford. And even the Doctor's wife, and this is a fantastic episode written by a very well-known author, Neil Gaiman, who explores the TARDIS in quite a lot of detail, and I think usefully replicates this idea of kind of the woman locked inside, and the idea of freeing the woman being an important part of what the underlying kind of psychic and dynamic nature of the narrative is. the whole of season 5, with the 11th Doctor, with the Matt Smith Doctor, is on the night of Amy Pond's wedding. Her wedding night, or the eve of her wedding, is spent travelling with the Doctor, and it's all about her deciding to not choose or to end up choosing her future husband Rory. And in a sense, it's precisely in that space of coming to terms with developing or not developing into the next stage of life that underpins the emotional dynamics of the episode. And of course, she wishes the Doctor to be present because she realises at the last minute that the wedding would mean nothing, the marriage would mean nothing, if it happened at a time when she'd lost touch with the Raggedy Doctor, the imaginary friend, the embodiment of her childhood fantasies and imaginations that the Doctor, of course, physically represents. Can't remember why I put that one there as well. But, oh yeah, because the other thing that never quite happens, or is always confused and messed up in Doctor Who, are babies and childbirth. Because, of course, generations and intergenerations are perilously played with in a world where time travel is possible. And even when the boy gets the girl, even when narrative kind of completeness is achieved, it's always with a massive footnote. It's always with a compromise. And what, of course, is happening here is that the Doctor has literally had to be split in two. An immortal Doctor goes off into the distance, into the TARDIS, crosses the horizon, leaves Rose's world, and leaves her with what she discovers that in her growing maturity she really wants, which is a mortal Doctor, a Doctor who can die, a Doctor who will age at the same speed as her. So she wants narrative. She's got to the stage of life where she can have narrative, but she's only got there because she's been through the adventures that the Doctor's enabled. And finally, the Doctor himself gets, inverted commas, married to River, who, again, without getting too complex, because it's already complex with River, who is the daughter of Amy and yeah. Anyway, exactly. It's the unspeakable. There's an awful lot of stuff which is unspeakable in Doctor Who. It's Saturday night primetime TV, but it's full of the unspeakable. And I think that's what draws us in, because we're thinking it, but we're not thinking it. We're saying it, but we're not saying it. And even this, of course, is a wedding which turns into a funeral and which turns into a fraud. There's a footnote here too. They're married, they're not married, etc. Now, how to capture that? Well, because the book is an academic book, and because you can't just say, "Oh, look at, look what Amy's done, look what River said," and so on. You try to conceptualise it, and what I've tried to do is think about Doctor Who as a kind of treatise on, or as an address to, what I think is a really powerful concept from a very old psychological work, which is Erik Erikson's Identity, Youth and Crisis. I think that one of the reasons we're compelled to watch Doctor Who, one of the reasons why we're prepared to continue to enjoy Doctor Who, is because it's a permanent dramatisation, almost by accident, almost inadvertently, but a permanent dramatisation of the idea of an identity crisis. An identity crisis and its ramifications for the worlds and the families and the connections that are around it. And one of the things that happens in Erikson's theory of identity, youth and crisis is he recognises this fantastic concept which is connected to the idea of time and how we experience time. And I think this is a very true concept, if you can say that. The concept that he talks about is called the psychosocial moratorium. And apologies, because that starts to become a bit of a mouthful, but it means what it says. It says that in our psychological life, in our society, in our relationships, in our connections to the work we do, the places we go, the thoughts we have, the images of ourselves that we develop, that is placed on hold. There's a moratorium on there being an answer to the question, who are you? And of course, Doctor Who is named, isn't he, about somebody who won't give an answer to the question of who he is. And a moratorium in our development is a fundamental part of growing up. Western societies, but also societies studied by anthropologists across the world, and this is Erikson's conception, work into the way they organise development, time, family, institutions, and so on, to incorporate a period of moratorium, a period of delay, as people grow up. And what I think Doctor Who has done is to take that emotional kind of period, that time, and to turn it into the kind of stuff of television, to say that actually we are fascinated with the idea of a moratorium. We love watching the Doctor's moratorium, and we love watching the space that's opened up by time which is somehow put on hold, because he can go back, he can go forward, he can step out of time, he can step out of narrative, he can rip Donna out of her wedding, he can go back, he can go forward. So a moratorium is a period of delay granted to somebody who is not ready to meet an obligation, or forced on someone who should give himself time, herself too. Amy is a good example of that. Amy Pond, arguably, is the story of a woman who needed to be given time on the night before her wedding to decide some important things about herself. Donna Noble is a woman who needs to be given time to work out that there was more to life than being a temp. And I think it's a really important detail that she was a temp. The idea that the kind of instability and lack of structure in her own life narrative was an important factor in who she was. By a psychosocial moratorium then, we mean a delay of adult commitments. And yet it is not only a delay period, it's a period characterised by selective permissiveness on the part of society and a provocative playfulness on the part of youth. And yet it also leads to deep, if often transitory, commitments on the part of youth. And I think that why we love time travel stories, and particularly the way that time travel stories are told in Doctor Who, is because they allow us to feel and articulate and symbolise again and again and again in lots of different settings this idea of moratorium. And they allow us to put this idea of moratorium in conflict with something else which is also important, because you can't live like this, just in case anybody... You can't live like that, but you have to live like that. See, one of the good things about psychoanalysis is you can say the opposite, and then so you have to keep certain questions open, but you also have to close things down. There has to be narrative, there has to be progress, but there also has to be delay and deferral. He's never had a life like that. And one of the things that the Doctor's very interested in, and one of the reasons why he's fascinated by the couple getting married in a story in one of the early series called Fathers and Daughters, is because this Doctor has never had a life where he goes from one day to the next, from one day to the next, where there's a beginning, a middle and an end. And I think at some stage he recognises that there is a vacuum, or there is a deficiency in his experience of himself and his capacity to relate to others, which is both a resource and a kind of burden for him. He's never had a life like that. Similarly, one of the wonderful little kind of side moments when at the wedding, when Amy marries Rory, is the Doctor just mutters to himself, watching the happy couple at the wedding, where he's kind of arrived in this very grandiose and dramatic way, wearing his top hat and tails. And he says, "Rory, the man who waited 2,000 years." And he waited, and he didn't travel through time, he didn't take any shortcuts, he waited one day at a time. And the fascination with waiting and developing and maturing, which goes throughout the stories, is a really, really poignant one. And of course, one of the things that the Doctor does wrong, including in Amy's life, is that he keeps on promising to arrive and is always late. He makes her wait too often. And one of the things that psychoanalytic people talk about and are interested in is exactly that moment, and the importance of waiting enough but not waiting too long in the earliest stages of development, that we might lose our connection to the world out there and lose our trust in the world if it makes us wait too long to be reciprocated, to be recognised or to be loved. So all of these companions, as well as the Doctor, are kind of stuck in a moratorium-like situation. I've got no A-levels, no job, no future. And then she says, but what I have got is a bronze medal for gymnastics. And then she leaps into the fray, and it's at that moment when she decides that it's okay, it's even necessary for her to leave behind a life which has got no future, which doesn't add up to much. She's a doctor almost. And Martha's really interesting because she's just about to decide to become an adult. But really what I think she's giving herself, and Martha's very switched on and clued up, I think she's giving herself time. She's giving herself that breather, which in a sense the world hasn't given her because of a drive to succeed too early. Donna, best temp in Chiswick. And this is literally her going down the aisle. She thinks that she's about to be completed. You know, I have to say, that just reminded me, I really hate that line in that thing, that you complete me. That was like a big line a few years ago. Hate that, because in a sense, because the romantic logic of the line, you complete me, is precisely wrong. Is that people shouldn't be completed. And the doctor never says, I complete you, or you complete me. He opens up the space. He says, I'm going to put you in a box, just like this would put you in a box, or just like a career as a doctor would put you in a box, or just like, I don't know, whatever job Rose would have found would have put her in a box. But he puts you in a box which is a moratorium, which is enormous, which is fantastically big, bigger than the universe, and driven by imagination. But she is the best champion, she's sick. And of course it's terribly sad what happens with Donna, which is that she has to go back. And that's why she's terrified of it. And of course Amy is getting married in the morning. And that whole series, season 5, is all about that question: what will Amy choose? Will she go back? Is she ready to go into Ledworth? What a fantastic name for a town. I come from Ledworth. I mean, you don't have to spell it out, do you? But it does always come to an end. And in a sense, Rose maybe is ready, having had the adventures that she's had, and having stepped through the various perils that she's faced. She's now ready to live one day at a time. And I think that's really interesting. And isn't that true of teenagers? Isn't it true of the kind of teenager in all of us, actually? That readiness to be prepared to live one day at a time, with commitments, with connections, with relationships, etc. That's always kind of both a draw and also a nagging kind of doubt or fear. And Doctor Who provides a little kind of televisual space where some of those ideas can be played out. You've got to feel bad for Rory, haven't you, really? But this is exactly about. This is where he sits. This is where the Doctor sits. The Doctor sits in that space between, as it were, normal life and the life which is never quite complete, which always has a surprise around the corner. So what do you do around here to stave off the you-know boredom? And here is Rose facing a similar choice, and she chooses the doctor that's going to die. She chooses the doctor that's prepared to die. Maybe there's a sort of maturity. Maybe there's a sort of maturity in recognising that you're going to die. But of course there's an excitement, isn't there, in the man that thinks he can never die, who's invulnerable, who's a daredevil, who's a risk taker. And I think working out where you sit between those two doctors is an interesting question for everybody, but particularly maybe for the female viewers. And I think female viewers of Doctor Who, you know, is a new feature compared to the classic series. There is a kind of a narrative and there is a storyline which is obviously directed towards and interested in the preoccupations, not just for male identification but for female too. Well, underlying all of this is this idea that time goes wrong. The thing that goes terribly, terribly wrong in Doctor Who is that time gets messed up. Time stops. Hence the end of season 6. You have the Doctor and Winston Churchill in ancient Rome, but you can walk down the street and there's a Bryman's and there's a pterodactyl flying down Oxford Street. Time has stopped. What would it like? What would it be like to live without narrative? And in a sense, I think this is very, very powerful, because what it says in a kind of mythic scale is that the moratorium can't go on forever. That's why there's some truth in the Doctor's realisation and recognition, in his capacity to embrace the idea that he has to die, or at least recognise and acknowledge his own death, because he has to let history back in. And I suppose the counterpoint, and this is the kind of conceptual opposite of the moratorium, is the idea of history. Now, it's really, really important that I underline that I do not mean history in the sense that people who study history mean, or in the sense that's written down in history books, but I mean history in a very specific sense, which is a history in which things actually happen in a particular order, a history in which things are over, where people are dead and they don't come back, where relationships have finished and they're never going to start again. There's a sense of history which means that you are prepared to acknowledge the past, to mourn the past, which not everybody is capable of. Because somehow, and one of the temptations for the Doctor even, is that he can always magically recreate the past and make it like that never happened. And don't we wish sometimes when we're teenagers that we can make it like it never happened, start all over again? I'm sure there's people here in this room who've started all over again more than once, in a sense, because of that wish, because of that desire to kind of move on. But there comes a point where you can't start all over again, where you can't command or control time, and that's where you recognise that there's a history which is outside of you, and there are things which are not part of your own making, part of your own capacity to control. And of course, the other important point is that that's actually the Doctor's job. Time Lords are in charge of stopping people messing up time. That's what they do. And I think that's one of the reasons why the TARDIS is a police box. Because in a sense, he's a policeman of time. He doesn't try to change history for the better, he tries to stop history going wrong. He tries to set time back into the right place. And that's really it. Now, I did want to kind of keep the theoretical and conceptual and jargonistic stuff to a minimum, but as a way of kind of drawing people's attention to the idea that you're going to be wanting to speak soon, I thought I'd try and put this into a kind of conceptual frame that I recognise, and which I hope will feed back into some things I've been trying to say in more kind of general terms. The psychoanalyst Thomas Ogden is a fantastic kind of populariser and developer of ideas in a particular strand of psychoanalysis called object relations. And one of the kind of things, I have to say, you can guess that nobody was really using PR when they developed their kind of key concept. But one of the key aims set out in kind of object relation psychoanalysis is the achievement of what they call the depressive position. And the important thing about that is to recognise that it doesn't mean being depressed. It means recognising that you do have to sometimes realise that you are limited. You do sometimes have to realise that you lose things, that you've been left behind, and that you have to bear the guilt of, for example, destroying relationships, of having done damage, of having caused some of the pain that's in the world that you live in. And that maturity in adulthood is partly connected to the capacity to tolerate the guilt that you feel as a consequence of your early experiences, including even the very earliest experience of a baby and a mother. Well, what Ogden says is that, yeah, that's all very well, but it is a bit of a rubbish name for it, because depressive position doesn't sound very appealing. Saying, oh yeah, you know, it's not going to be like a, you know, it's not going to be a popular thing people go. But he thinks that a really good way of reframing it is to say that what people need to achieve, or what people need to set in counterpoint with that kind of open, moratorium, kind of creative, I can do anything, I can go back, I can go forward conception of themselves that Erickson talks about, is they need to recognise that they do live in this historical position. And he says that the term historical position represent what is normative in the achievements of the psychological organisation of the depressive position, i.e. the ability to tolerate loss, the ability to really know what it means that Adric has died, the ability to really know what it means to, for example, leave poor Rory, you know, forgetting as if he never existed, to kill your whole race, as the Doctor's done. After all, he walks around with a great deal of guilt as the Doctor. He's not just a kind of serial monogamist who never actually does anything, but he's also seemingly guilty of genocide. So mourning rather than depression, and this is what he says, mourning rather than depression is the psychological process by which previous object ties are relinquished. And in a sense, what's brilliant in Doctor Who, I think, is it's a fantastic series of mini dramas which is preoccupied with the idea of remembering and forgetting properly, of moving on at the right speed, of leaving things behind but also never losing connection with them, of keeping separation for the things that matter while also recognising that you can't always keep them in your control. So I think what Doctor Who does, and it's fantastic for people who are growing up, and adolescence of course is part of that, but of course we're all growing up in a way, aren't we? Well, it's a fantastic story about managing time and about managing the pressures and the denials, on the one hand, of a time that is inexorable and which is beyond our control, but also of a time which is very, very much of our control and which is exciting and energising and a space to develop, a space just like the TARDIS. Now this is a fantastic episode, Closing Time, which I talked about before. And of course I said it's all about death and it's all about saying goodbye. It's all about the Doctor demonstrating that he has the ability to mourn. But because he's demonstrated that he has the ability to mourn, he also manages to teach the father of this child, Craig, that he doesn't need to be terrified or scared of his baby anymore. Because actually, what's really, really important is that just as separation and mourning recognises how you can leave the past behind, it also opens you up. It means you can tolerate some of the difficulty and pain of being connected in the present. So as well as being a story about death, it's also a story about life. And I think Doctor Who is fantastic because it's mainstream, primetime TV for kids, which nevertheless talks about all these things quite directly, in quite an entertaining way, without ever preaching, without ever teaching, but in a sense, just by making it a really, really interesting, exciting drama. I think with that, I'll stop. Okay.